Ever wanted to reach phase 2 of Radon with a single guard counter? Well, that's a thing you can do now. Today we're talking about deflecting hard tier. This thing is already really strong by itself, but when you add a little bit of math, stupid things happen. First step is get yourself a sword lance and these 3 talismans. Why sword lance specifically? Not only does it have pretty good guard boost for a weapon, which means you can use it two-handed, but it just so happens to be the best weapon in the game when it comes to guard counter damage. The attack deals thrusting damage, which is really important because usually when you're doing a guard counter, the enemy is recovering from their attack, which means they're open to something called a counter hit, which makes them take 30% more damage from all pierce attacks. This actually happens to players too, and you can see it in your stat screen if you're quick enough, but they nerfed it to 15% for players because it was a little too strong in PvP. So when you narrow it down to all the weapons that deal pierce damage with their guard counters, then narrow it down further based on which ones can get weapon buffs, there's only a few good contenders left. Sword Lance has so much attack power right out the gate that despite having a lower motion value for guard counters than every other heavy thrusting sword, it's still gonna outperform every one of them, as well as every other weapon class dealing pierce damage, only barely losing to Rusted Anchor in terms of damage. The only reason Rusted Anchor isn't the best is simply that the attack is too slow and too short ranged. Since Sword Lance's attack comes out faster and reaches further, you're much more likely to get the hit in the first place and actually have it count as a counter hit when you do. That's not to say Rusted Anchor can't work or that Sword Lance will always work, but it's definitely the most consistent choice. Now let's get into the meat of the build, these 4 items in particular. Deflection hard tier not only lets you block like you're playing Sekiro, it also boosts the damage of your guard counter depending on how many deflections you've landed recently, capping out at 80% after 4 deflects. Most of the time you can ignore this mechanic and just guard counter whenever you can anyway, so you don't have to wait for all 4 hits. But having what's basically Royal Knight's Resolve in the form of a crystal tier as a secondary effect added on to its already very strong effect is pretty crazy, not gonna lie. Especially when you can stack it with the actual Royal Knight's Resolve. Curved Sword Talisman gives you a 20% boost to guard counters, and Two-Handed Talisman boosts two-handed attacks by 15%. These are pretty self-explanatory since we're attacking with two-handed guard counters, so it receives both boosts. Spear Talisman is actually just a 15% boost to those thrust counter hits that we talked about earlier. Keep in mind, it stacks multiplicatively, as pretty much all things do in this game. So we now get a 49.5% boost to our damage when landing counter hits, which is pretty big, and again, that's multiplicative with everything else we're getting. These 4 items alone with the counter hit can boost our damage by a total of 271%. But what if we added a few more optimizations? Well, I put together a couple builds, one of which is at level 1 that's easier to work with and deals up to 10,000 damage, and one of which at level 125 that deals up to 26,000 and can take a few hits, but needs more maintenance to get it working. Let's start with the level 1 version. Since we're at level 1 anyway and plan on deflecting everything, we're bringing our HP below 20% using a Warhawk's Talon and Bloody Slash since it requires more dex than we have. So we cast it with no FP into a wall and trim our health down really fast. Since we're low HP, we've got Shriek of Sorrow as our weapon buff, Twinbird Kite Shield in the offhand, and Red Feather Brandsword as our 4th talisman. We've also got Strength Knot Tier, Godric Rune, and Horde Warrior Helm to increase our strength to 30, which effectively becomes 45 when two-handed. And finally, we add on a few general damage buffs. Blood Boil Aromatic, the Golden Vow item, and Rakshasa Gauntlets and Greaves. We're not using the torso because we'll fat roll, and since not all attacks are blockable, we'll need to be able to dodge sometimes. If you don't want to farm items, you can swap the buffs with Flame Grant Me Strength and the Golden Vow Ash of War on a dagger, but the buffs I'm using are more convenient. At the fog wall, you just pop your rune, smack into a wall, use your 3 buffs, make sure you're two-handing, and you're good to go. Get your deflects in and get big damage. If you want to do something a little safer, you can swap two-handed talisman with Starscore's Heirloom and use the shield to block instead of the weapon, since it has 100 physical negation and much better guard boost. So you can block a lot more, and even if you block too early, you're not dead. Obviously, this reduces your damage output, but the option is there. Now let's talk about the level 125 version where we've already got the stats to not need any strength buffs. Our spread is 60... 60... Vigor. Then we have 10 Mind, 17 Endurance, 61 Strength, 11 Dexterity, 10 Intelligence, 25 Fifth, and 10 Kansas. Test me, comment section. I dare you. Anyways, 17 Endurance lets us medium roll with the stuff we're using. 60 Vigil Sticks is always a good plan. 25 Faith is because we already need 24 to cast a good regen spell, so might as well go up to 25 to cast the spell version of Golden Vow since it's stronger. And all the rest of our points are in Strength. Now, I started with Wretch class, but we're already past the second two-handed Strength soft cap, and it doesn't matter what our Mind, Arcane, or Intelligence is. So if you're using a different starter class, you can add or remove points from Strength accordingly, and the build will still function pretty much the same. Our weapon buff in this case is Royal Knight's Resolve, but if you don't like having to cast it again every 10 seconds, you can use Cragblade instead. The remaining buffs we have are 3 pieces of the Rakshasa set, Blood-Sucking Tear, Blood Boil, Golden Vow spell, Blessing Boon to counteract some of the HP loss from Blood-Sucking Tear, Black Dumpling, and Aged One's Exaltation. This is so we can use a Frenzy Zone to proc Madness on ourselves and fill out the buffs that we used to get from the low HP equipment. Once again, you can swap the items used for Flame Grant Me Strength and something else that gives you Madness. But duration is very critical in this case since we're dealing with Royal Knight's Resolve, so I very much recommend using what I'm using. Now, since almost all of our buffs last longer than the fight, the buff order doesn't matter too much, as everything but RKR happens before the Madness gets procced. I like to prioritize having the most HP left when walking through the fog wall, so I do Frenzy Stone, Blessing, FP Flask, Vow, Blood Boil, Physic, two-hand your sword, hold forward while Magnus procs because you'll recover from the animation slightly faster, walk through, drink another FP Flask, dodge the initial rush attack if the boss has one, Royal Knight's Resolve, deflect 4 attacks, and boom. The rest of your moveset still hits like a truck, of course, but I think that's one of the strongest guard counters you can ever get without doing crazy nonsense like hard swapping. Now, before we leave off on the video, I just want to talk about a few quirks about deflects and guard counters. The deflection hard tier doesn't just boost your guard counter damage, it also boosts the stance damage as well. Why, Miyazaki? Guard counters already have some of the highest stance damage in the game. After a bunch of testing, I found out that the stance damage boost only caps at 40% instead of 80%, which is a little disappointing, but it's still pretty useful since all stance damage buffs in the game can stack with each other. Yes, they stack multiplicatively. This means you can get an Executioner's Great Axe, which normally deals 36.3 stance damage with a guard counter, and then add on Cragblade as a weapon buff, Stormhawk Dean as your aura buff, replacing Golden Vow, Stone Barb Crack Tier, then deflect 4 times to get a total of 87 stance damage. Sword Lance deals the same amount, but why Executioner's Great Axe specifically? Why do you think? You can actually stance break Melania in a single guard counter this way, and even when the Stone Barb inevitably runs out, you can still stance break Consort Radon in only 2 guard counters, making for a fun crit-oriented build, at least in solo new game. Bosses actually gain resistance to stance damage as you summon players and go into later playthroughs. It's also not really gonna be stronger than the other build, but it's still cool. Fun fact, the highest stance damage possible in a single hit is doing exactly this with Blood Fiend's Arm, which deals 118 stance, almost enough to one-hit break Consort Radon. We just can't have nice things, I guess. But yeah, so that's pretty much it for the build. Be sure to like and subscribe because I got more videos on the way. Next big video is probably going to be one of those regular math videos I made that poll about. It's still somewhat video game related, but you know, you'll see. For now, just do the algorithm crack.